There is a kind of silence that is not born of weakness, it is born of clarity. At first glance, it looks like exhaustion. It looks like giving up. It looks as if someone has simply stopped caring. But most of the time, that's not what's happening. When a deeply sensitive person suddenly falls silent, something far more profound has been activated. Carl Jung observed that, at certain critical moments in life, psychic energy stops flowing outward into the external world and turns inward instead. He called this movement the introversion of the libido, a return of attention to the inner world, where the mind begins to reorganize its own reality. What appears to be withdrawal is, in truth, an internal audit. It is the moment when illusions begin to collapse, when justifications lose their power, when perception is no longer filtered through hope or fear. And once this process begins, something irreversible takes place. Because after someone sees the truth without distortion, they can never go back to seeing the way they did before. And almost no one notices the exact moment when it all began. The world tends to interpret this silence in the most superficial way possible. They call it drama, they call it coldness, they call it emotional immaturity. Some say it's just a phase, a passing bad mood, an exaggerated need for space. But almost no one realizes that behind this apparent distance, an extremely complex psychological process is unfolding. For most people, relationships are about reaction. If there is conflict, you argue. If there is pain, you explain. If there is tension, you confront it. Silence, then, is seen as inaction, as if nothing is happening. But the opposite is true. Carl Jung described that, at certain critical moments, the psyche withdraws its projections. This means we stop seeing the other person through the qualities we ourselves were assigning to them. For years, many people live projecting hope, goodness, positive intention, and potential onto others. They don't just see what is in front of them, they see what they believe could exist. When this mechanism begins to fail, something shifts dramatically. The energy that was once directed toward understanding, justifying, and sustaining the other person turns inward, and in that return, a kind of observer mode begins. There is no longer a need to react impulsively, no urgency to explain feelings or defend perceptions. There is only attention, and silent attention is extraordinarily powerful, because when projections are withdrawn, reality is no longer softened. Small details that were once ignored begin to make sense. Contradictions that were once tolerated become undeniable. Patterns that were once dismissed start to reveal themselves. Silence, then, is not emptiness. It is the beginning of clarity. There is a very specific moment when this shift happens, and it is almost always invisible to those on the outside. It's not the last argument, not the most intense fight, not the shouting, the tears, or the door slamming. Most of the time, it's something seemingly small, a careless remark, a behavior that has already repeated itself too many times, or simply the quiet accumulation of subtle inconsistencies that finally reach a breaking point. That is the moment when something internal reorganizes. The mind, which once searched for explanations to preserve the relationship, to maintain harmony, to sustain the image it wanted to believe in, simply stops trying. Not out of a lack of love, not out of a lack of effort, but because reality has become too undeniable. Suddenly the person stops softening what they see. What was once interpreted as "he's just stressed" is now recognized as a pattern. What seemed like an isolated incident reveals itself as repetition. A broken promise stops being an exception and becomes evidence. And when this clarity emerges, it does not arrive with anger. It arrives with calm, a strange calm, dense, almost unsettling. It is the calm of someone who has stopped fighting what is right in front of them. Carl Jung understood that when consciousness withdraws its illusions, a structural shift takes place. The person stops reacting emotionally and begins to observe. There is no longer an impulse to convince, explain, or correct the other. There is only recognition. And recognition does not shout. It grows quiet. What looks like indifference is in truth the birth of lucidity. And once that lucidity settles in, there is no returning to the previous stage. Because once you have seen clearly, you can no longer pretend you haven't. Imagine someone who has always been the steady presence in every relationship. The one who listens before reacting, who tries to understand before judging, who gives the benefit of the doubt even when already hurt. For years, they carry difficult conversations, tolerate inconsistencies, overlook behaviors that unsettle them, because they believe that understanding is a sign of maturity. There is always a plausible explanation. Always a context that justifies, always the hope that with enough patience, things will eventually fall into place. But quietly, something begins to build. Small frustrations left unspoken, feelings dismissed, intuitions suppressed to preserve harmony. The body senses it first, a heaviness in the chest, a strange exhaustion, a constant tension that never fully fades. Until one day, something seemingly simple happens. Perhaps a cold response, perhaps an obvious contradiction, perhaps just the repetition of a pattern that should have been resolved long ago. And instead of arguing, the person does something unexpected. They go quiet. There is no scene, no threat to leave, no drama, just a subtle shift in their gaze. The energy that once moved outward now pulls inward. The conversation continues around them, but internally, a far more important process has begun. They start observing, and as they observe, they begin connecting dots that once felt scattered. What seemed isolated reveals itself as part of a sequence. What appeared to be an exception exposes an underlying structure. The narrative that sustained the relationship starts to collapse from within. Nothing explodes on the outside. But on the inside, everything has changed. What is happening in that silence is something Carl Jung described as the withdrawal of projections, one of the most powerful movements of the human psyche. For much of our lives, we do not see people as they are. We see them as we believe they could be. We project onto them our own integrity, our empathy, our capacity for commitment. When someone lies, we think maybe they're just confused. When someone hurts us, we justify it. They didn't realize. When someone fails repeatedly, we insist, deep down, they mean well. This is not naivety. It is projection. It's as if we are lending the brightest parts of ourselves to sustain the image of the other person. We lend our honesty and assume they are honest too. We lend our loyalty and presume reciprocity. We lend our emotional depth and believe they feel the same way we do. But when the silence begins, those loans are reclaimed. Suddenly, the lens shifts. The person stops seeing through what they hope for and starts seeing what is actually in front of them. Small inconsistencies that were once softened now appear sharply defined. That ambiguous comment reveals intention. That repeated behavior reveals a pattern. That broken promise reveals character. And most striking of all, there is no longer any effort to protect the other person's image. The mind, which once worked to preserve the narrative, now works to dismantle it. Every memory is revisited without the filter of hope. Every conversation is re-evaluated without the need to maintain harmony. It's like an accountant reviewing years of records and realizing the numbers never truly added up. This process is not loud, it is clinical. And when projections are fully withdrawn, something irreversible happens. The person doesn't just see the truth, they accept it, and acceptance is far more final than discovery. As this process unfolds, something even deeper begins, the internal audit. In the silence, the mind starts revisiting the past, but this time without the need to protect anyone. Old conversations resurface with new meaning. Phrases that once seemed harmless now sound like ignored warning signs. Moments that were minimized reveal a pattern that had been there all along. It's as if the scattered pieces of a puzzle finally click into place. That time you doubted your own perception, the moment you apologized even though you knew you weren't wrong. The occasions when you felt a subtle discomfort but chose to trust the other person's version of events. It all returns to awareness, now without the filter of guilt or hope. You begin to realize it wasn't oversensitivity. It was accurate perception. It wasn't an overreaction. It was intuition trying to warn you. This process can be uncomfortable because it demands brutal honesty. It means admitting that you saw the signs before, but chose not to confront them. It means acknowledging that some of the pain might have been avoided if you had trusted yourself more. But this clarity does not come to punish you. It comes to free you. In the silence, you stop trying to convince the other person of your truth and begin affirming your own. There is no longer a need to explain every detail. No impulse to defend your emotions. There is only understanding. And when that understanding settles in, the energy that was once used to sustain someone else finally begins to sustain you. But it's important to understand, no one arrives at this silence overnight. This point does not emerge after a single mistake or a single disappointment. It is the result of accumulation, years sometimes of constant adaptation, of excessive understanding, of one-sided effort to maintain balance where structural imbalance already existed. Before the silence, there is exhaustion, an exhaustion that is not only emotional but physical. The body begins to send signals. Fatigue that sleep does not fix. A constant heaviness, unexplained aches, a lack of energy for activities that once brought pleasure, a kind of internal numbness, as if the mind were too overloaded to keep processing stimuli in the same way. The person still tries to talk, tries to adjust, tries to be more patient, more understanding, more resilient, but internally, something is already at its limit. Carl Jung understood that the psyche has mechanisms of self-preservation. When consciousness insists on maintaining a pattern that is causing harm, the unconscious intervenes. And that intervention does not always come in the form of an explosion. Sometimes it comes in the form of a shutdown. Silence, then, is not a strategic choice. It is an organic response. It is the nervous system saying, "This cannot continue at this pace." At that point, the person is not trying to punish anyone, not trying to manipulate. They are trying to survive psychologically. What looks like coldness is, in truth, protection. Because continuing to react in the same way would mean continuing to drain oneself. And when that depletion reaches its limit, the only possible response is withdrawal. Silence does not begin as power, it begins as necessity. But within that necessity, something far greater is born, the possibility of transformation. It is within this withdrawal that what Jung described as the incubation phase begins. Carl Jung believed that the deepest transformations of the psyche do not occur under bright light, but in the darkness of silence. Just as a seed germinates beneath the soil and a caterpillar dissolves inside the cocoon before becoming a butterfly, the human mind requires a period of retreat to reorganize its internal structure. During this phase, the person is not merely reflecting on what happened. They are becoming someone different. The old identity, built around pleasing, understanding, sustaining, adapting, begins to be questioned, not in a dramatic way, but in a structural one. A quiet question arises. Who am I when I stop carrying what isn't mine? This is the turning point. In the silence, the person starts to distinguish compassion from self-abandonment. They begin to realize that understanding someone does not require tolerating everything, that loving does not mean erasing oneself, that being emotionally deep does not imply accepting any behavior. An internal reorganization is taking place. Values are reassessed, boundaries are redrawn, priorities shift. The energy that once flowed outward begins strengthening the center. And most importantly, this transformation does not depend on anyone else changing. It unfolds regardless of external reactions. That is why, when the person emerges from this silence, something essential has already shifted. It is not about revenge. It is not about calculated indifference. It is about psychic maturity. Silence was the laboratory, and what is being built there is not merely a response to the past, it is a new structure for the future. At the center of this transformation lies something many people avoid their entire lives: the integration of the shadow. Carl Jung taught that the shadow is not merely the dark side in a moral sense. It contains all the parts of us that were repressed in order to maintain an acceptable identity. For someone who has always been understanding, patient, and available, the shadow may hold the exact opposite: strategic detachment, the ability to say no without guilt, selective indifference, non-negotiable boundaries. For years, these qualities were labeled as negative. Being cold is wrong. Being firm is selfish. Pulling away is immature. And so they were pushed into the unconscious. But in the silence, these parts begin to surface. The person realizes they can be kind without being permissive, that they can love without abandoning themselves, that they can understand someone and still choose not to remain in the dynamic. This is the real shift. It is not about losing sensitivity. It is about making it conscious. Shadow integration does not turn someone into a hardened or insensitive person. It turns them into a whole one. Now there is discernment, the ability to recognize when compassion is healthy and when it becomes self-sacrifice. The capacity to see when persistence is a virtue and when it is attachment. And perhaps most importantly, a new relationship with oneself begins to form. The person no longer seeks external validation to confirm their perceptions. They trust their own reading of reality. They trust their own boundaries. They trust their intuition. This is individuation. It is not about becoming perfect. It is about becoming complete. It is essential to make a clear distinction here. Many people confuse this transformative silence with the so-called silent treatment, a strategy used to punish, manipulate, or control someone. But they are entirely different phenomena. The silent treatment is a tool of power. It implicitly says, "I will withdraw until you give in." Its intention is to provoke discomfort, create insecurity, and force a reaction. It is a form of emotional pressure. The silence we are describing has no such objective. Carl Jung understood that when the psyche reaches its limit, it withdraws to preserve the individual's integrity. It is not about making the other person suffer. It is about stopping one's own internal suffering. It is not retaliation. It is reorganization. In this kind of silence, there is no strategic calculation, no psychological game. There is exhaustion. There is a need to restore one's center. The person is not thinking about how to affect the other. They are trying to understand themselves. Externally, it may look the same. No response, distance, fewer words, but internally, the movement is the opposite. In the silent treatment, the intention is to control the environment. In transformative silence, the intention is to reclaim one's sovereignty. And that difference changes everything, because when someone grows quiet to heal, they are not creating a battlefield. They are creating a space for reconstruction, and those who fail to understand this often mistake protection for coldness, when in reality it is maturity taking shape. When the person finally begins to speak again, something is different, and everyone can feel it. Their voice no longer carries that intense emotional charge. There are no more desperate attempts to be understood, no lengthy explanations, no detailed justifications. The words become direct, concise, almost neutral. It's as if the drama has evaporated, but this neutrality is not empty coldness. it is consolidated clarity. Carl Jung observed that after certain processes of inner transformation, the individual stops reacting from the wound and begins acting from consciousness. This means decisions no longer arise from emotional impulse, but from a deep understanding of what is acceptable and what is not. At that point, the change becomes unmistakable. The person who once tolerated small inconsistencies now sets boundaries without hesitation. The one who used to explain themselves repeatedly now understands that their limits do not require anyone's approval. There is no more negotiation rooted in guilt, no more concessions made out of fear of loss. And this can be unsettling for those who were accustomed to the old dynamic, because the former version sought reconciliation at any cost. The new version seeks internal coherence. Sometimes this transformation leads to a definitive distance. Other times, it leads to a restructuring of the relationship. But in either case, one thing is certain: the person does not return to who they were before. The silence was the transition. It was the period when the old identity was questioned and a new structure was built. And once that new structure is established, it no longer depends on the other person's reaction to remain firm. It depends only on one's own consciousness. And that is precisely what makes this change so profound and so irreversible. If you are living in this silence right now, do not treat it as weakness. Do not rush it. Do not break it just to ease someone else's discomfort. This silence may be the most honest moment of your life. Perhaps you have spent years doubting your own perception. Perhaps you grew used to over-explaining, justifying the unjustifiable, softening what hurt in order to keep the peace. But when the mind decides to stop, observe, and reorganize, something sacred is taking place. You are reclaiming your sovereignty. And the real question is not whether you will speak again. The question is, will you trust what you saw when the filter fell away? Will you uphold the boundaries that were born from that clarity? Or will you convince yourself it was an overreaction just to return to what no longer makes sense? If this message found you at the right moment, write in the comments, "I trust my perception." Let that sentence be more than a comment. Let it be a silent commitment to your own consciousness. Here, we explore the invisible layers of the mind, the hidden movements of the psyche, and the truths that are rarely spoken out loud. If this content resonated with you, continue watching the next videos on the channel. There is much more about shadow work, individuation, and psychological awakening that deserves to be understood. Your silence may be the beginning of your transformation, and transformation begins with awareness. See you in the shadows of the next hidden truth.